The Golden Stallion, the man of tomorrow, Savzu, the rated R radio star, actually in studio for a little Patreon content, which doesn't happen too often. Actually, it's happened quite a bit often lately with the guests that I've had. And oh man, what an honor it's been to have all those guests. Of course, just the amazing MK Lords, Paige Peterson, who you can't beat. She's amazing. Everybody, it's been wonderful. And of course, the lovely and hyper intelligent Dr. Stephanie Murphy has joined me a lot recently as well. Just want to put it out there that, yeah, we'll be getting back to more normal, well, I don't want to use the word average because boy, Sovereign Tech is anything but average. But I guess I'll say more normal where, it's just me and whatever. And there's going to be guests more in the future, but whatever. We'll be getting back to some more normal formatted episodes of Sovereign Tech, coming in, just the next few weeks. So anyway, I have content here that I had promised and had teased on social media, various social media, like Instagram and some others, where I went to Monticello. In fact, went there with the lovely and hyper-intelligent Dr. Stephanie Murphy. We were down in Charlottesville, which, boy, Charlottesville has been kind of a hotbed of white nationalism, it would appear, as late, but that's neither here nor, well, I mean, it's important, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. So this, now, what I'm talking about, of course, again, is Monticello. That is the home of Thomas Jefferson, if you didn't know. And yes, it is directly located in Charlottesville, so it only made sense that I would visit it. Now, personally myself, I've driven through Virginia many a time, including the WV, and, I mean, years ago. And for some reason, as much as I mean, at various points in my life, I've had differing respects for Thomas Jefferson. As it stands right now, I don't have a whole ton of respect for him, but whatever. Regardless, certainly in my past has been kind of a heroic figure. But for whatever reason, I never went to Monticello, even as a historian. And it's interesting to note that Monticello is, I think it's the only presidential home that is also considered a UN World Heritage Site. So, it has historical meaning and precedence, and it's, recognized around the world, for having that. So why I never stopped there in years past, I don't know. I'm not sure why that never clicked, why it never came together. And I can even remember in the past driving through, Virginia and seeing the signs for, go to Monticello, and why I never just turned and said, all right, yeah, let's go see this. I'm not sure. But apparently in the past few years, which would have been a time frame where I wouldn't have passed through there. But in the past few years, they have significantly upgraded, made renovations and whatever else, to Monticello. So maybe I saw it at its best recently. And well, anyway, I'm going to share with you, we're not just going to talk about Monticello. I'm going to talk about Monticello, of course, but I'm also going to talk about Thomas Jefferson. I'm going to talk about what I found there because I'll admit I'm a person that has some odd historical theories, and I think some of these were very much bolstered by what I saw at Monticello. But so we'll talk about those. We'll talk about some of those. I mean, we might even get into the Illuminati, and other nonsense like that. So there's going to be a lot to cover here, really. And yeah, we'll just, Monticello is the backdrop. So I hope you enjoy it. I guess I want to start this off with, I don't think Thomas Jefferson really needs any introduction. I mean, I can say, why I considered the guy, kind of quasi-heroic, but there are deep problems with that heroism that, at some point, I think anybody that starts to get into the work of Thomas Jefferson has to face. And I was impressed, I'll say this out of the gate, I was impressed that at Monticello, which is now, I think it's operated by like the Thomas Jefferson Foundation or something. It's interesting because Monticello, there was the real possibility back in the, 19th century, when, after Jefferson died and his daughter, took it over effectively, even though she was kind of already running it for seemingly decades anyway. There was the real chance that Monticello would have just been sold off, and who knows, it could have been torn down. Actually, it was sold off. It wasn't until much later in the 19th century that I think it was like a naval, Navy admiral, like an ex Navy admiral or something, ended up buying it and bought it for, the purpose of preservation, for posterity. And then eventually would, fall under a nonprofit, which I think is the Thomas Jefferson Foundation. But anyway, that's not part of the, you get like, when you go there, you get this guided tour of everything. And that's, they didn't really discuss a whole lot of that. Not to say that they didn't go into depth. They definitely rely a lot upon questions from the people that are getting the tour. But I'll talk more about the tour in a minute. Anyway, so I don't think he, the point being is that like some of the ugly side of Thomas Jefferson is certainly on display when you go to Monticello. That's what I was going to say. I had a point where, coming out of the military, I got out of the military in like later 2004, and, you sort of, not that I had any real patriotism going on for myself, but you start to get this interest in the founding fathers and all this stuff. I mean, for whatever varying reasons that began happening for me, you quickly, as you start studying the founding fathers, George Washington, John Adams, all these different characters, you start to find a lot of problems, with them as you really start to dig deep and as you become a fan. I don't think anybody that really studies the founding fathers, and I mean, going beyond, like, say, the works of Dave Barton, who is really an apologist, a Christian apologist for the founding fathers and all that. Once you start digging deeper into, these characters, you suddenly find, these people were in many ways like either idiots or not idiots, but they're not the good guys. Like they're not the good guys of history that they get painted as. They have a lot of flaws. Of course, they're human. I have lots of flaws, but they had a lot of flaws, and lives were on the line as to where, maybe with you, your flaws or my flaws, lives are not on the line. Right. So Thomas Jefferson, I want to say that really, like, not counting, say, James Madison, but Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine are sort of the two characters that I think a lot of people that start getting into, the founding fathers and the founding of America and everything, like, they're the last two that you can really hold on to as far as like being perhaps good guys of history, not to get into any kind of great man theory or anything, but you can hold on to them because they have a lot, those two seem to really understand freedom, and liberty and things like this, or at least, it appears to be that way. Thomas Paine is certainly, now there's a character of history that I actually still have a ton of respect for, which I can't really say for Thomas Jefferson. But we'll break into all of this. Jefferson was, of course, and this is important, I just want to lay out a couple things. Thomas Jefferson was unique for quite a few reasons. Of course, he was an inventor, a brilliant inventor, and you see a lot of that in Monticello. And he was also, quite the writer, and, not just the writer as far as like books or anything like that. He didn't really do that, though we are going to talk about the Jefferson Bible, as we break into all of this. But, I think what he has to write in his letters to his friends, like, say, James Madison or others, is very, very important stuff. Now, you want to be careful and you want to understand, and actually it kind of gives them their weight. Something I've talked about, and this will be kind of roundabout later on too. Something I've talked about in the past on Sovereign Tech, whenever I've talked about history, particularly like religious, and Christian history, is that the bulk of the New Testament is made up of letters, and they are very casual letters. And they're made up by letters by the Apostle Paul, right? And now I'm not going to get into some kind of, was Paul really Saul, and who is really Paul, blah, blah, let's just take this one at face value, okay, and say that, well, whoever actually wrote those books, they're attributed to Paul, but they are, at least in design in the New Testament, the bulk of the books of the New Testament, not counting the Gospels, are very casual letters to churches, all right? Now, kind of my old saying goes is that if the Apostle Paul knew that the letters that he was writing to, say, the Church of Corinth or Thessalonica or something like that, if he knew that they would end up becoming the holy word of God, or that they would be researched and used to form the faith, of Christianity, that he would have been a whole lot more careful about what he wrote in them. Thomas Jefferson, I don't know that he had any idea that what he would be writing down would end up being a part of, what would become historical record for posterity in America, and would in many ways influence what people think of America, or what, the United States of America should be, etc. So it's important to keep in mind that they are casual letters, but because of that, I think Thomas Jefferson's letters, and we might get into a couple of them during this little Patreon episode. I think his guard is down, and he's saying things that he sure as hell wouldn't say in front of Congress, or he wouldn't say as president. So that's stuff that we'll definitely get into. So yeah, Jefferson's this brilliant guy. Another thing that's important about Jefferson is that he is very tall, which is kind of odd for the day. We're talking, during the Revolution, obviously, 1776 and all that, 1780s, all the way into the early 19th century of his life. This is a guy who's like 6'2". He's taller than me, and that's kind of an odd thing. And it ended up being a question that I had while going around Monticello, but I'll save that. The dark part of Jefferson's character, because while he wrote some very, very, fascinating, liberty-oriented, even, and we'll get into this. There's a letter later on that I want to read. He was actually clearly an anarchist. And most people don't want to talk about that, but he was looking towards the goal of anarchism, getting put on display. Unfortunately, he felt like that there was some kind of incrementalism that had to be gone through. I mean, the guy ended up becoming president, though arguably you could say he never really wanted to be president. He was almost forced into the position, to a degree. But he really was. However, then we run into the immediate problem, the dark side of Jefferson, which is or one of the dark sides, which is that he owned slaves. And, at Monticello, they made it very clear that over his lifetime, he probably owned about 600. There was about 200, operating at Monticello at any given moment. And you can say that in his writings, he had some idea that, slavery is not okay. Fact is, he still had them. Walking around Monticello, the conditions were not exactly the best. Maybe they were better than some other areas, but I mean, how do you even break down degrees of, the slaves are treated a little bit better here? I mean, like how does that doesn't make it any better. That doesn't make it fucking okay. So, that's a part that we'll end up having to, really to talk about, as well. But, just bottom line, like I said, he doesn't really need introduction. There's a couple points I just wanted to bring up there, but this is a seminal figure in history. No question about that. I mean, he really, really is, or really was. So Monticello, let's start breaking down into this. Again, it is in Charlottesville, takes up about, at its largest was about 5,000 acres. I mean, there's just, this is, miles of land. I mean, when you're standing like at the center, when you're standing like at the actual house of Monticello, it just, the view is obviously incredible and you're just seeing out forever. And all of that is part of Thomas Jefferson's land. Now, another interesting little point about Thomas Jefferson to understand is that he is a person that, and this kind of colors a point that he made as, well, I don't know if he was exactly president at the time, but I know he did talk about it while he was president. And that is, he was a person in debt. He, at the time when you married into families and everything, you would inherit, a lot of people know about dowries, right? Where a married couple would inherit, some kind of whatever, an amount of money or property or something, from marrying into a family or whatever. Well, that sword cut both ways, is that also, while you could inherit a dowry and a lot of money or land or something along those lines, you could also inherit a lot of debt. And that is exactly what happened to Thomas Jefferson. And he inherited the land that makes up Monticello, from his father. From his actual father. But then in his marriages, he ended up, inheriting a lot of debt from all that, and he even inherited debt from his father as well. I mean, there was just, his life was kind of a mess, and that alone sort of makes it a miracle that he was able to build Monticello, because this was not a cheap enterprise. This took a lot of effort, cost a lot of money, and it was one of the most stark things that I first noticed when I went to Monticello. And I'm more talking about the main house at the moment. And they tell you this, when you go for the tour of the house, and you can only go through the house as a tour. You can't just walk through it yourself, and kind of take your time. You also are supposedly not allowed to do any photography. So I have to tell you everything from memory. You're not allowed to take pictures. Obviously you can find pictures online and all that. There's been professional pictures taken, whatever else. But I myself, I have to tell you from memory exactly what I saw. And if you want to verify it, well, you can either find the pictures online, or you can go visit Monticello yourself, which isn't a terrible idea. It does cost like $20 or $30. I think it's like $30 to visit Monticello. There's like a big visitor center at the beginning. That's one of the new things that they have with the gift shop and all that stuff. And there's actually fascinating stuff in the gift shop that I liked. But, and there's like a little movie you can watch about it. I didn't end up watching the movie, but I don't really need to. Like, I know Thomas Jefferson's life very well. Like I said, he was, in the past, kind of a hero of mine. Again, he's, other than Thomas Paine, no founding father, holds any kind of like really glowing light in my mind anymore. So it's certainly not Jefferson. But anyway, let's continue on with what I was saying. One of the stark things when you start the house tour is, you're standing outside the house. You're just about to go into the main, in the main doorway, into kind of the greeting hall of sorts. And they point out to you that what looks like brick at along the side of the house, or at the front of the house, what looks like brick is actually wood that has been sanded to look like brick. Now, this isn't something that they've done. This is something that Thomas Jefferson himself did, because he was trying to cut costs, because, again, he was a man in debt. And so it looks just like brick, but once you go up to touch it, you can knock on it, and knock, knock, it sounds like it's wood. But, a lot of these various things that you see, just like these brilliant little innovations to cut costs, but make the place, look like $1 million, effectively. And there's a lot of that around Monticello, just tons of it. I mean, and it speaks to his inventiveness. But he wasn't the only one that was inventive. You find out that as you're touring Monticello, a lot of his slaves were, or at least, what was it? Was it John Hemmings? Not Sally, but John Hemmings in particular was, a slave, a black man. But he was brilliant. And he was a full-on artisan. Like he did all these creative things. And as you go around, the entire Monticello estate, not just within the house, though you keep hearing about it in the house, how John Hemmings did this and did this and did this and did this. When you start to explore the broader estate, you see just how much this guy really did. I mean, John Hemmings had to be working almost nonstop, but he was fucking brilliant. The guy was practically, from the look of his work, you'd almost think this guy was a Da Vinci. I mean, he was that good at everything he did. And a lot of, now, when you start going into Monticello, they make it very clear that about 75 to 80% of what's in Monticello is all original, which that speaks very well itself. In fact, even when you get in there and you look at the floors, like the floor is just, this beautiful wood diamond pattern design, that all they have to do is buff it. It was built so well. And again, by John Hemmings, it was done so well that it just lasts, it's such great quality. So in the main hall, there's some interesting things in there. There's this very clever clock that, you find out very quickly about Thomas Jefferson himself, that he was a very methodical human being, and that he tested, time and weather and all these different things on a literal daily basis for decades. And he would take measurements of things, again, every day. And, he probably had, whoever, either he'd hire somebody or he had some kind of slave that would mark down, various times and, what the weather was like and everything. I mean, this is somebody who, he's an Enlightenment figure, right? He's a product of the Enlightenment. And who are Thomas Jefferson's three main heroes? John Locke, Isaac Newton, and Sir Francis Bacon. Okay. And, so Enlightenment figures, are all, they're scientists, or proto-scientists in any case, and or real scientists. And their idea is that you can figure out everything by measuring everything. And so Thomas Jefferson is really big about measuring. In fact, the whole house, all of Monticello, is kind of based off around, the Fibonacci sequence, sort of the golden ratio and everything. And you see a lot of that. So there's a lot of clever, like there's this impressive clock that runs on various weights and everything, all of which he designed. Again, that speaks to his brilliance as an inventor. Don't worry, we're going to get into the conspiratorial stuff in a minute here. And so one of the things that actually shocked me when you're kind of in the main hall, though, was now there's maps everywhere, and all of that's kind of very believable and and understandable that there's maps, again, measuring maps, really understanding the world. But there were mastodon bones, and fossils right in the main hallway, and I thought that was really, really interesting. Now the mastodon is kind of a cousin to the woolly mammoth, and I had no idea that he had any interest at all in that sort of thing. I thought that was just fascinating, really to see. But they're there, and you can kind of get a good look at them. But the tour sort of has to move along. And in fact, if you Stephanie was looking at those in particular, and the tour started to move into the next room, and eventually, one of the workers there said, ma'am, you need to move along with the group. So again, this speaks to, they really don't let you look at things for very long. And I think they want to make sure you're not taking something. I mean, I don't think that there's anything nefarious here. It's not some Freemasonic conspiracy that you can't look around, in Monticello. I think they're just trying to protect everything. And obviously they've done a hell of a job. If, like I said, it's still, 75, 80%, what was there originally. So you end up going into, now, I mean, there's copies of the Declaration of Independence in there, blah, 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 blah. There's some interesting stuff there, but that's not necessarily what I want to get into. You end up going into the next room, which is actually a teaching room. Understand that, Monticello itself, the house is a 33-room house. It has, 3 levels, underneath where, you find kitchens, bathrooms, all those different things, kind of a basement of sorts. And then above, or the kind of the main area where you can walk around, has various bedrooms and other rooms, like I said, the teaching room, the main hallway, and all that. And then you have the second floor, which is, a bunch of bedrooms. Funny thing, too, is that Thomas Jefferson is obviously really big on saving space and being very efficient. He makes the smallest of stairwells to get access to the second. In fact, some parts of the second floor, you actually get up by ladder. Just to save all of that space, which is that's interesting. I don't know what to make of that necessarily, but, that's just the kind of guy he was, just, very efficient, and didn't believe in being very wasteful. And it probably, without having to fashion very expensive stairways, which at the time was all the rage, that probably saved him some money too. Now, my point about him, kind of being in debt and how that speaks about him personally, he often, he made the quote where he said that maybe one of the worst things that a government can do is pass off the debt of one generation onto the next, and that shouldn't really happen. Obviously, that's coming to a degree from personal experience, because he's this brilliant guy, and not to say that he was inherently bad with money, but he inherited, a lot of bad money. And so, obviously he thinks, no, we shouldn't be passing on debt to the next generation, because that's exactly what happened to him. So it's not necessarily that somehow he was this brilliant, person that knew how to govern or whatever. It's just that, his personal life spoke to that fact. And, throughout his presidency, he tried to do various things about debt, about national debt, to no avail, of course. And, we all know what that looks like now. I mean, trillions of debt. Obviously, he didn't succeed at all. Regardless. So, yeah, that's interesting. You never get to see the second floor of Monticello either. So you end up going through, so whatever, you can't see that, blah, blah, blah. So you end up going through the house a bit, and then you end up in this, what's kind of the dining hall, and sort of, I forget exactly what they call the room, but, it's called the drawing room. That's what it was called. Meaning that, it's where you're, not that that's where you draw something or it's for artistry, even though he would do that. It's the area where everybody's supposed to kind of gather and to some degree get drawn into. And this is the most interesting room in the house. Now next to it is of course a proper dining room. And when the guides are telling you, describing everything in Monticello, literally, I mean, there's 33 rooms, those are meant for bedrooms for visitors and everything, because it was a trek to get to this place. I mean, like, you definitely wouldn't just go there. It'd take like 5 hours from the nearest, other sign of life in Virginia to be able to get to it. And so it's not like it's something where, you just go there and then you'd leave that night. No, you'd stay a couple days, a few days maybe. And he would host, no one would pay for it. He would host all of these people. And, there would be, on the average, there would be some odd 40 people dining with Thomas Jefferson every single night that he was there. And probably every night that he wasn't there, there was quite a few people, doing that, including, his daughter's children and everything would be there, blah, blah, blah. I mean, this was an expensive operation, which we'll talk more about the expensive operation, also in a minute. But anyway, you have the proper dining hall next to it. You also have his office adjacent to that where, he obviously did a lot of his reading. You see, what remains of his library, because of course he donated the bulk of his library to Congress. Well, he didn't donate it. He sold it to, there was a sum of money involved. But because one of Jefferson's main points is that, a nation without a library is, a nation of idiots. And if your nation's full of, I mean, I'm paraphrasing what he said, but if your nation's full of ignorant people, they can't possibly, have a great nation. So, it was really important to him that a library existed. And that's why you have a Library of Congress, because of Thomas Jefferson. But anyway, the drawing room, again, is where the really interesting stuff is. And we'll break into, well, you know what? All right, let's pause on the drawing room. How about that? And then, but let's skip on to, to some of the other stuff. So next to the drawing room, we'll come back to the drawing room, which is where all the interesting shit is, but let's get the little stuff out of the way. So you have the dining hall. Then, next to that, there is, what I think ended up is getting called the Madison room, because it is this main bedroom that, would, primarily where John Madison would stay, who was, in many ways, Thomas Jefferson's best friend, outside of, varying times with John Adams, early on in life and later on in life, because they would have a huge separation. And so that's, the fact that Madison's there. I mean, the only reason I'm bringing up that bedroom is because I want to highlight the importance of James Madison to Thomas Jefferson's life, because we're going to read a letter that Jefferson writes to Madison, that I think has a lot to say about something we're going to talk about that in the drawing room. So Madison is a huge deal, is somebody who, could pretty much indefinitely stay and always has a room, a beautiful room by the standards of the day, ready for him to be able to stay there, himself and his wife and whatever. And like I said, that's going to get important, but those are the main rooms that you see. The rest of Monticello, when you get outside of the house or when you go underneath the house, that's where you end up getting into where all the slaves, did their business. And this is the part where, everything, it appears that all of the wonderful freedom loving things that Thomas Jefferson would say, would appear to be bullshit. And I know people want to talk about, well, but he also wrote letters where he said that he knew that it was wrong and that eventually it would go away, blah, 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 but he still kept them. He could have dismissed all of them. Now, did he hold on to the slaves because, because it was the only affordable way to get done what he felt like he needed to get done? Yeah, you could make that argument, but then, you're still being an asshole. And worse. I mean, asshole's not even a strong enough word. You're still being a tyrant. You're still being scum, for keeping slaves. And, the use of slaves, I mean, this is, oh boy. I mean, I could get into a whole other conversation about this, because slaves, the idea that there is no civilization without slaves, is an argument that is honestly, it's kind of tough to debunk. And I think, in fact, Silicon Valley and a lot of tech companies are aware of this, and that's why they're pushing so hard for AI and machine learning and all this. They need robots to be able to do this, because otherwise, people are going to recognize the future that they're trying to make to be completely unethical, because it requires the backs of slaves. Genuine slaves. I'm not just talking about taxpayers. I get sick of that fucking argument that taxpayers are slaves. No, that's horseshit. Unless you're like in indentured servitude, or if if you're off getting chipped off to labor camps, I'm sorry, you're not a slave. because you could choose not to work. So I'm not saying that your life's going to be great if you do, but I'm just saying that you do have the choice, as to where slaves do not. So I'm not going to get into that argument right now. But clearly the lifestyle that Jefferson wanted to lead, and maybe even the future that he was working towards and trying to build, which we'll talk about at the drawing room, at the time certainly required slaves. I think that's fairly obvious. That was the only way that was going to get done. And he did not have the money to pay people proper, to be able to do it. He couldn't even afford, to put actual, like I was saying earlier, he couldn't even afford to put actual brick in the front of his house, and I don't say that I insult him for having slaves, but I don't say that with insult, the fact that he didn't have the money to do that. Obviously he inherited a very ugly situation. So, and you find, it's just like, it's crazy. Like you find out that some of the, like the nails that had to get made, even just to do the business around, like literally, like just iron nails, like they would have competitions and, like kids were being made to make like 10,000 nails in a day. Just like it was nuts. The conditions that they had to be under. Now, maybe, again, maybe at Monticello, they didn't bother with the whips, like perhaps in the South or something like this. And please don't give me any League of the South fucking, revisionist apologetic history. You're full of crap. But anyway, maybe stuff like that happened, but it just doesn't matter. And they talk about that he only freed, out of the 600 slaves in his lifetime that were working in Monticello, he only freed, I think, 7 of them. And I think 3 or 4 of them were after they were dead, that they became like technically free. The only one that he would really free would be Sally Hemings and like her son or whatever it was. It's really, look, it's unforgivable. It's just unforgivable. You cannot look at, Thomas Jefferson in a heroic light and especially go to Monticello and see, the conditions and, to understand the slave labor, the slave work that actually went on there, and somehow say this was a nice, good guy. You can't, and you can say, well, maybe he was being pragmatic. Like I get it. Like I get the pragmatism, of having slaves to be able to, live a certain lifestyle or something like that. I get it. But pragmatism doesn't make things okay. The ends really do not justify the means. They never do. So yeah, sorry, if you have some special place in your heart for Jefferson, maybe he has some good words. Yeah, well, good words. That's how ideas begin, but they're just words, and he didn't live up to them at all. So something to keep in mind there. It's really disgusting. And when you see it, it really hits home. And I've visited plantations, down south, because I lived in Florida for a few years, and I'd go up, Georgia and all these different areas and everything. It's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. And it's not that long ago, it's really not. And it's something to pay attention to. So anyway, I want to just make that like super clear that aspect of Thomas Jefferson is totally unforgivable. And that you really see it. And I was, dismayed and pleased at the same time that there was no whitewashing of any, no covering up of the fact that there were slaves all over the place here. And in fact, we went with an older woman who she had been to Monticello, many times. And she said that they never talked about it, like 20, 30 years ago, when you visited Monticello, it just didn't come up. They would say like workers and things like this. So yeah, I'm glad that finally there's an admittance, that there was a problem here, and that this was not okay. And it actually was in direct contrast to exactly, to the words of the Declaration of Independence, to a lot of the things, be it in letters or in addresses or whatever that Thomas Jefferson made, that were in his words, that obviously, were that he was a contradiction. He was a hypocrite about, because he kept slaves. So anyway, now all that said, I wanted to make sure that was abundantly clear before I got into some, things that could be seen in a positive light, and that I'm not like, oh, Jefferson's so fucking great, because I don't think that way. I recognize his inventive brilliance. I recognize his brilliance with the pen. I recognize a lot of brilliance. Again, brilliance does not a good person make. But anyway, I want to get into some of the more interesting aspects, and this all starts with the drawing room. Where we get into this. And I want to talk about the Jefferson Bible as well. And this is where we're going to get into some of my more interesting theories of history. We're already about a half hour in, so I hope you've made it this far. I hope what I was saying before wasn't too discombobulated or boring or anything, because now we'll get into the really, the juicy stuff. As far as, what was going on there at Monticello, it would seem. Now, when you go into the drawing room, there are a lot of pictures around. There's pictures of, for the day when Monticello was being built. There's pictures of, contemporary figures. There's pictures of people from the past, pictures of people from the, from the far past. Or from ancient history, that you'd kind of see in there. And there was also not just pictures, and paintings, but there were also, various like statues, busts, not really statues, but busts, more particularly, of varying characters, which I think is, kind of important to, to keep in mind. So, and also keep in mind, I mean, this is, this starts getting built in like I guess about the 1770s. In like the 1760s, like 1768 would be about when it would start. And also just real quick to keep in mind, like there were kind of two Monticellos. Like there's one that he started building, and I don't know what exactly that would end up looking like, but then there's a time frame where Jefferson would start visiting for various political reasons. He would end up visiting Europe. And when he would come back home to America from Europe, suddenly he's like, oh, I get it now. I want to make this place look European. Now that's important. Okay. Particularly, he wanted to make it look French. That is also very important because he would end up visiting France a lot, kind of as an ambassador and other things. And I think there's some real bearing there that he was heavily influenced by what was going on in France or, in Europe at the time. Now, what was happening in Europe was a time of tremendous political upheaval. We're talking about the French Revolution, a lot of other things, some real things like Freemasonic conspiracies and all this different stuff. That some of those at the time, Freemasonry was a very legit and real thing at the time. And some of their conspiracies against local governments or even larger governments were absolutely real. Look, when you start talking about another aspect of Freemasonry was the Bavarian Illuminati, okay, which has to do with Adam Weishaupt, which we're going to talk about here in a bit. Understand when you start talking about the Illuminati and Freemasons in the 18th and 19th century, those stories are generally real. I mean, not like the New England Illuminati scare. That's a very different thing. That's also from the 18th century. I guess it would have been kind of 19th. Well, there was like 2 or 3 of them. So whatever, it spans that certain amount of time. Other than that kind of, sort of sensationalist newspaper stuff, from that time frame, a lot of these, things that happened, particularly in Europe, were very real. The Bavarian Illuminati, led by Adam Weishaupt, which would meld with Freemasonry to a degree, was very real. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson proves it in a letter that we're going to talk about. So when we're talking about it at that time, it's real. When you start talking about what's the Illuminati doing in the 20th or 21st century and all this stuff, that's where it becomes, is that actually a thing? And like, what is Freemasonry today? Is it just like, effectively a dinner club? Yeah, probably. Like that's where you get into where it becomes questionable. But in the, 18th and early 19th century, not so questionable, not questionable at all. This stuff is really happening. These are real moving political forces of their day. Freemasonry being a part of the founding of the United States of America, being a part of the Revolutionary War, abso-fucking-lutely, and for very good reasons, because you need it, to start a revolution at the time. Look, they didn't have the signal app. Okay, they didn't have Facebook or whatever else, to pull off an Arab Spring. They had to do it behind closed doors with secret handshakes and all this stuff just to be able to keep the English from being able to know what's going on. That's how you did a revolution. I'm not saying that I agree with the Revolutionary War. I actually don't. I certainly don't agree with King George either. I don't think war is valid. But I'm just saying that, yeah, sure, Freemasonry was all a big part of this. And I'm just trying to point out to you that at that time, these things were very real. They're not conspiracy theory. They are conspiracy fact, in those days. So now back to the drawing room. Okay. With the drawing room, this is definitely a room heavily influenced by European architecture. You can see it. It's actually the first room, and thus Monticello is the first house in the United States to have skylights, like where the sun would come right down. Is there some kind of importance to that? Well, I'm not going to go there. Some people want to talk about that sort of thing where where's Stephanie's making a motion as above so below. I'm not going there at all. So, but. It's a beautiful room. And like I said, just surrounded by busts and, in various pictures. A couple of the pictures, one of them I thought was missing, but a couple of the pictures in there are of Sir Francis Bacon. And another one is of Isaac Newton. Two very important figures that have very controversial theories that they're laying out. When you think of Sir Francis Bacon, you think of The New Atlantis, which was a book released posthumously that was all about maybe how to set up, kind of a future society, and one that honestly didn't have government, but that's, well, not exactly government, but that's another story for another time. And of course, Isaac Newton, who had very interesting theories, biblical theories. And of course, both of them were scientists in their own right. So, it's understandable why, so Jefferson would claim that John Locke, which I didn't see the painting of John Locke, which I thought that the three of them were together because they are considered the Holy Trinity for Thomas Jefferson. John Locke, Isaac Newton, and Sir Francis Bacon. Like, these are the characters that he considers effectively holy, because they did so much. And you can imagine that he researched their work, to no end. So I think there's some importance in whatever Newton, Bacon, or Locke would have to say, that colors Jefferson as a person and his own, his own goals. So those are in the drawing room, and there's some other, there's a painting of Benjamin Franklin in there. There's a painting of some other American figures, some French figures, and whatever else, that were important to the Revolutionary War. The most interesting painting in there, though, and this is kind of where I want to start. The most interesting painting in there is a painting of John the Baptist, and his head, on a platter, right, being served up to Herod and his wife, due to, his wife's daughter doing her little dance and everything. Anyway, I think that there's some importance to John the Baptist, that painting of him. Again, it's not Jesus in there. All right. And this is we'll get into the Jefferson Bible here in a minute, but and it's such, like, it's a huge painting at that. And it's kind of taking up its own section of the wall. It's so fascinating that John the Baptist would have such, albeit it's a grim picture, but that it would have such prominence. Now, the tour guides of Monticello would say to you that, well, so the purpose that he has a lot of these like biblical paintings around, and there were other ones, that he has those is because it would, he'd want people to ask about it, and he'd want the kids to ask about it, and he'd be able to give them a lesson on morality, because he would consider, more particularly the New Testament and perhaps parts of the life of Jesus, to be the penultimate in moral, in a moral code. But I don't know that I buy that, because again, this painting was fucking huge in comparison to all the others in that room. And I couldn't help but think that, yeah, this has prominence. This has importance. There's a reason that this is such a big deal. Now, this gets into one of my wilder historical theories. It is not my own. Other people have thought it, that's where I got it. I didn't come up with it, personally. But the theory is this, and I'm not going to spend a bunch of time breaking down, like the specifics around why people came to the conclusion of this theory. But the theory itself is that John the Baptist was actually supposed to be the savior. okay, of the Jewish people, or of, oh boy. See, now this is where I run into a crossroads, because like, how far do I go with this? Okay. So there is, all the way. Stephanie says all the way. All right. So there is this theory that within, all right, Freemasonry, here, let's do that. Freemasonry traces its history to a character named Hiram Abiff. In fact, when you end up, when you're getting inducted into Freemasonry, you reenact the murder of this character. Now, Hiram Abiff is a person that supposedly built Solomon's temple. Okay, you know, the first Jewish temple and all this, because he had some kind of secret knowledge of, you know, how this was supposed to be built and how it would be, you know, most effective, you know, for life on earth and blah, blah, blah. I mean, you know, you get into a whole bunch of stuff around that. Now, the way to build Solomon's temple properly was, you know, this is another case of where the ends don't, or where the ends do not justify the means. Like, it was, and this kind of speaks to Freemasonry as a whole. Like, there is a way, the way that you build the perfect structure is through the same way of building kind of the perfect human, that you get to human perfection. Okay. And that's, you know, arguably what Freemasonry is all about, is getting to, you know, human perfection. And so now what, you know, why did Solomon have to hire Hiram Abiff, you know, to be able to build this properly? Like, what were the secrets that he knew? Wouldn't have, you know, if it's some kind of great secret of how to build, you know, Solomon's temple. And again, a lot of Christians and even Jews don't think that this character Hiram Abiff was necessarily a real person. There's mention of a Hiram in the Old Testament, but you know, it becomes speculative just how important this character of Hiram Abiff actually was. Or if he was even real. So, you know, this is really talking from a Freemasonic perspective, not necessarily Christian or Jewish. But the concept goes is that, like, okay, so what exactly, or the story goes, like, what did Hiram Abiff know? Why didn't just like the Levites know what this is? Why didn't Solomon just know, you know, how to build his temple? Like, why did he need this guy that seemed to have a whole bunch of secrets? And so the idea goes is that, and this is an idea, a theory forwarded by Alan Butler and Christopher Knight, along with some others, that Hiram Abiff had like this really secret knowledge. He understood a Judaism, like kind of within Judaism. And there's a tremendous book. It goes under a couple names. It's this, what is it? Solomon's Power Brokers is the original title of it. Now it has a new title called The Hiram Key Revisited, which I recommend checking out if you want an idea what all this means. I mean, I could start laying out a bunch of weird terms that some of these, you know, alternative archaeologists use, like, you know, like Alan Butler, and, you know, where they talk about the star families and all. I mean, it's a whole show on its own. I'd have to spend so much time talking about that. But the bottom line is that there is this secret kind of Judaism that gets passed down, and that eventually expresses itself as Freemasonry. Okay. But this secret Judaism that was constantly looking for a Messiah, even though the concept of the Messiah would, you know, branch out into broader Judaism. The theory goes is that who they were really looking for, and this has to do with planetary alignments, has to do with Venus and all this shit. Okay. That the real person that they were looking for was actually John the Baptist. And when John the Baptist unfortunately died, you know, too soon, they brought in John the Baptist's cousin, that being Jesus Christ. And Jesus would have to fulfill the role of John the Baptist. And then, of course, you know, the idea is that, well, then the Gospels got rewritten to where John the Baptist was actually just kind of clearing the path for Jesus to come, which, I mean, is still kind of true. But, you know, the whole idea goes is that, and again, this is the part I don't want to spend a whole ton of time on, but I'm just laying it out for you, that John the Baptist was originally supposed to be the Jewish Messiah. And honestly, I believe that. I think that makes a whole lot of sense, because you have much better, for a couple of reasons. One is that you have much better historical evidence of John the Baptist actually being a character as compared to, you know, Jesus Christ. You know, you don't have so much about him. And also the fact that, like, with, you know, you have more of a narrative of what John the Baptist was doing throughout his life, as to where with Jesus, you have, like, you know, there's huge swaths of time where you're missing what exactly Jesus was doing. Now, when Jesus ends up becoming the Messiah, was Jesus a real person? Did he change the narrative of perhaps what John the Baptist was originally going to say? And that's why Judaism doesn't accept, Jesus Christ as being the Messiah and all this. I mean, I'm really in powder keg territory here, even talking about this stuff. Yeah, maybe. I mean, that just gets into a whole bunch of theories, but it's interesting that, with John the Baptist, that John the Baptist is such a central figure in Thomas Jefferson's home. I really, I really think, like, I don't think you can come to another conclusion, because again, just the size of the painting, its prominence, where it's put and everything, it's almost at like dead center of the house. I think that means something, and so was Jefferson, was he effectively kind of buying into the Freemasonic lines, in history, and saying that, oh yeah, well, John the Baptist was actually supposed to be the real character here. And so, let's venerate what he was going to deliver, blah, blah, blah. Were the Jews ever going to accept what John the Baptist had to say? Obviously it would seem not. Herod would, sorry, folks. I mean, like there's so much I'd have to spend 5 hours, explaining all this. So that gets tough. So I apologize if this is sounding very confusing, because when I tell people these kinds of stories, it's usually like I'm spending all night long, kind of describing a lot of this. So anyway, arguably John the Baptist is very key to Freemasonry. And the argument goes that originally John the Baptist was supposed to be the Messiah, blah, blah, blah. So that points at I think Thomas Jefferson, that painting points at Thomas Jefferson having an alternative understanding. And I'm not talking about like alternative facts. I hate that is like a term now, because now anytime you use the word alternative, it ends up being a joke. No, really, there's an alternative version of history. And I think Thomas Jefferson knew it. Okay. And in so doing, it's interesting that suddenly, what does he do? He starts crafting, and this is an important thing. And in fact, some of the people that we were with had no idea that this was a thing. I knew about this because, again, I started studying. Thomas Jefferson became a very heroic figure for me at a point in my life. Not anymore, but there was a time where he was, and so I wanted to know everything he wrote. And when I found out that he made his own version of the Holy Bible, I flipped. I was like, oh, whoa, and I found, this again, for me, it was years ago. But a lot of people there at Monticello that were touring with us were like, what? Holy shit. And I actually kind of spoke up and started talking about and explaining more about this Bible because, I'm so familiar with it. And this would end up started getting written in like in 1819, or really that's about when it would end up getting finished. He started working on it, partially due to conversations with Dr. Benjamin Rush, who is also, considered one of the founding fathers. Would have been in just at the turn of the 19th century, so we're talking, the 1790s here, that he would start working on this. And what the Jefferson Bible is, so hopefully this will help hone down the conversation, and give it direction again. So the Jefferson Bible it's just the New Testament. It's not even just the New Testament though. It's just the Gospels. Okay. Now the interesting thing here, so it's just it's just the life of Jesus. Effectively, doesn't get into anything that the Apostle Paul wrote, or like the Book of Acts, or anything like that. In fact, Thomas Jefferson would very clearly state that he thinks the Apostle Paul bastardized what Jesus was saying and everything, and that's an interesting perspective as well, because again, if there's the secret kind of version of Judaism, or I'll just say the secret priesthood. How about that? That way it doesn't get confused. Because also, Jefferson would say that he wrote, he wrote the Jefferson Bible, or what would technically be called the Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. He wouldn't call it the Bible. He also said that he wanted to remove, kind of the edicts of the Jews from anything that Jesus had to say, which Jesus would quote the book of Deuteronomy often, in the Gospels. So there was certainly some removal of Jewish ideas, from it. So, this stuff was originally perhaps for a secret priesthood, and like what John the Baptist was doing and all that, because only those secret priests, knew who was coming, right? Knew that John the Baptist was going to be a thing, or that, Jesus was coming, right? The star, all that crap. the Apostle Paul would be the figure that started, again, he's the apostle to the Greeks, right? That's accepted history. If you think Paul was real, which I certainly think Paul was a real person, even though I'm an atheist. Don't understand that, folks. If you didn't know that already, I'm an atheist, so I don't really have any skin in this game. But anyway, he would be spreading this stuff out, and he would kind of, there's even, what was it? The Council of Jerusalem, where literally the Apostle Peter and the Apostle Paul were arguing with each other. Look, do we give this message to the Gentiles or don't we? Do they have to follow all of the, do they have to get circumcised? What parts of Jewish, of kosher law, what parts of Jewish law, Levitical law, do they have to follow? Blah, blah, blah. And that was, that was a huge argument, and probably, it was an unsettled one, honestly, at the end of the Council of Jerusalem, where, Paul was really changing Christianity, at the time as he went along. Now, you can believe, if you're a Christian, you can decide whether or not you thought, Paul was divinely inspired or otherwise. But anyway, the message goes beyond perhaps what was the original intended audience. And so, that's something to keep in mind. Of course, what is the intended audience? Was it the secret priesthood, or was it the Jews, or was it supposed to be everybody? These are where all these debates end up going. But he ends up, Thomas Jefferson ends up writing The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, and in it, he takes out, like I said, a lot of the, Levitical law, quotes from, various Jewish edicts and all that. And he takes out all of the supernaturalism. He just removes it. Any miracles that Jesus does, all that stuff, he completely takes it out. And he also does, he does a very interesting thing. Before I tell you the interesting thing that he does, and the interesting thing is the languages that he uses. I'm going to read a little bit here, and this is from Thomas Jefferson's own words, writing it to John Adams in a letter. In extracting the pure principles which he taught, talking about Jesus, we should have to strip off the artificial vestments in which they have been muffled by priests who have travestied them into various forms as instruments of riches and power to themselves. We must dismiss the Platonists and Platonists and the Stagirites and Gamalielites and eclectics, the Gnostics and scholastics. Interesting that he says the Gnostics as well. We got to remove them from it. Their essences and emanations, their logos and demiurges, aeons and daemons, male and female, with a long train of, or shall I say at once, of nonsense. So he's saying we got to get rid of all the bullshit. This, Jesus's words, whatever he had to say, has been trampled upon by various different religious groups, and we got to get, he's really saying we got to get the religion out of what Jesus had to say. We must reduce our volume to the simple evangelists, select even from them the very words only of Jesus, pairing off the amphibologisms into which they have been led by forgetting often or not understanding what had fallen from him, by giving their own misconceptions as his dicta and expressing unintelligibly for others what they had not understood themselves. There will be found remaining the most sublime and benevolent code of morals which has ever been offered to man. I have performed this operation for my own use by cutting verse by verse out of the printed book and arranging the matter which is evidently his, and which is as easily distinguishable as diamonds in a dunghill. The result is an octavo of 46 pages of pure and unsophisticated doctrines. And he would go on to say that, Jesus did not mean to impose himself on mankind as the Son of God. He'd call the writers of the New Testament, he'd say they're ignorant and unlettered men who produce superstitions, fanaticisms, and fabrications. Again, he called the Apostle Paul, the first corrupters of the doctrines of Jesus. So he was trying to get to what he felt was a pure product of what Jesus actually had to say. But why did it even matter what Jesus had to say? Why not just write it off? In fact, largely when you read The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, when you read the Jefferson Bible, you're ended up with something with quote unquote truths and axioms that a lot of other people had said in the past. Like the Golden Rule. Golden Rules, Jesus didn't come up with that. Romans came up with that. 100 years before Jesus even walked the earth. And it existed in varying forms, even before then. So it's interesting that he even bothered to say, well, let's run with Jesus. Now it could be great marketing for a great moral code. We'll talk more about that in a second. But The interesting thing with the Jefferson Bible, for me, the most interesting aspect of it isn't even really what it says. It's partly in the languages that are used. So he used 4 languages to create the Jefferson Bible that he translated from or cut and pasted from. He used English. Makes sense. It's, native tongue, right? And then he would end up using Greek. Makes sense. It's the language that the New Testament was originally written in. Then he would use Latin. Also makes a ton of sense. Because Latin, the Vulgate is in many ways the oldest version of the New Testament that we have. The Greek versions of the Old Testament that we have, today are, they're not the autographs. They're much older. Okay, we know that they're based perhaps, or I shouldn't say we know, we think that they're based off of various autographs. Autographs just means the original copies as written by the people that wrote it, is literally physically written down by the people that wrote it. But the Greek versions are much later, and there's versions of the Vulgate that we have, which is just the Latin version of the Bible, that are older than the oldest Greek versions we have of the New Testament. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind. So it makes sense to use Latin. Totally, using the Vulgate, in some ways, it might even be the purest product of the New Testament that you can get your hands on. But then the 4th language he used is the oddity. This is the odd man out. And there's a few different ideas as to why he may have used this. Most people don't pay attention to the fact that they did. I guess they just see it as a historical afterthought. I do not. I find it very interesting that he used this. He used French. Now, why use French? If you've got the Greek and Latin, why, what could possibly be in the French Bible that, in the original French, that could be so goddamn interesting? Now, one of the easy answers perhaps is that he had fallen so much in love, with French culture and all this, that he did it as a sign of respect that, oh no, I used your Bible too. It's okay. I respect you for who you are. Maybe it was a way to appease those of the French Revolution or something, which the French Revolution was in many ways an atheist movement. Certainly they were trying to get rid of church as much as they were, a tyrannical government, blah, blah, blah. And I'm not speaking well of the French Revolution, just saying. Or is it that, kind of a Da Vinci Code situation where, there's the Priory of Sion and there's all these different French groups that were passing things down, throughout history. Were they that secret priesthood and all this? And so in the French versions of the Bible, that there are some secret understandings of what's actually going on. Did the French version of the Bible perhaps have a more accurate representation, by the translators into French that, would be more helpful to what Jefferson was trying to get out there. Any of those are fascinating, but it is important to bring up that, wow, for some reason he felt it really important to use French, and other than just the simplest, well, it was a way to pay homage to the French that he had a passion project with, or a personal passion for, maybe that's all it was. And if so, okay, fine, whatever. But I find it a little bit odd that he did use that. And I think that there's a little more something to it, even though I obviously can't say for certain what exactly that would be. So, all right. So that, that's the Jefferson Bible. He found it important to have this guidebook of morality to pass down. But then why did he do that? And I think this is where we want to get into another letter that comes from, not uninterestingly, a year after he started really working on the Jefferson Bible. Okay, because he starts working on the Jefferson Bible. He starts, discussing it with, like I said, with Dr. Rush, in this would be 1798, 1799, something like that. However, at the time, Jefferson would have an encounter with another character in history, one that, in some ways is praised, other ways is vilified. And there's even whole conspiracies around this guy. Okay, but he would have an encounter with this character, and then he would write to James Madison about this encounter, which I think is very important. So the character is Adam Weishaupt. Now, a lot of people might instantly know that name because this is the guy who is generally, credited with being the founder of the Illuminati. Okay, he is interestingly. And before you think that there's we're talking about some kind of crazy erasure of Jewish history because Jefferson, erased, a lot of the Jewish edicts and influence out of with the Jefferson Bible, understand that Weishaupt is, it considered to have come from, to some degree, a Jewish family, even though this guy is German. Okay, now the conspiracies around Adam Weishaupt are thus, or at least this is just a couple of them. I mean, there seems to be an endless amount of conspiracies about everything, particularly these days, ever since YouTube came out. But so yes, he definitely did start the Illuminati. He did get into Freemasonry. He did combine the Illuminati with Freemasonry. Those I think go without historical question. But then there's the theory that Adam Weishaupt actually was George Washington, like that however that ended up shaping up, either Weishaupt, took over George Washington's life, or George Washington was a character that never actually existed, and Weishaupt was, just took on a new name and became George Washington. In historical studies, there is a test called the Washington test, okay, which is this idea that, when you're looking at a historical figure, can you prove that they actually lived? And they call it the Washington test because it's actually hard to tell whether or not George Washington was a real person. In fact, Jesus fails the Washington test. Of course, so does George Washington, right? It doesn't have any real descendants. I mean, like there's a whole bunch of problems, with George Washington, but that's not what we're here to talk about. Adam Weishaupt, so I mean, there's the theory that he either became or was George Washington, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine, whatever. I'm not going to entertain that. Here, the other thing is that Weishaupt, who's again was, ethnically Jewish, his family dies at his parents died at a very young age, and he ends up getting raised by his godfather, and his godfather sends him off to Jesuit school. So then he's a Jesuit, and then boy, if you don't already know that there aren't a billion conspiracies around Jesuits, I don't know what to do for you. There are. Okay. And I'm not going to, none of those roads need to be explored here, and they hold really no bearing. So unless you want to say that the Jesuits created Freemasonry, blah, 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 whatever. It would seem to be like, personally, the whole Jesuit conspiracies, a lot of that horse shit, at least it coming into fruition with Adam Weishaupt, I think is very problematic, because Adam Weishaupt would appear to be, as much as, say, Thomas Paine would appear to be an atheist. Arguably, Jefferson was an atheist as well. You get guys like Dave Barton and a lot of apologists for the Founding Fathers who want to say, no, absolutely not. He was not an atheist. I would argue that Jefferson was an atheist, and certainly I would say Weishaupt is, and I would definitely say that, I mean, you can say, well, no, they're really deists. No, I think that was just an excuse. That was the comfortable thing that they could express to people at the time. But really these guys were, for all intents and purposes, they were atheists. That being Thomas Paine, Adam Weishaupt, Thomas Jefferson, and a whole slew of others. I mean, there's a reason that all the superstitious and supernatural stuff was removed, say, from, the Jefferson Bible. So Adam Weishaupt and Thomas Jefferson would, in this time frame of 1798 to 1800, would have an encounter. They would meet each other. Did Adam Weishaupt stay long at Monticello? Well, I don't exactly know that's what that encounter looked like, but whatever, they spent some time together. And in so doing, on January 31st of 1800, Thomas Jefferson would write to his good buddy, who he would, share his deepest, darkest secrets with. And again, his good buddy that had a whole room in Monticello would write to him saying, expressing his encounter with Adam Weishaupt. And I'll read it here. Dear Sir. So I'm reading an entire letter, all right, because everything in it is really important. I'm not going to explore all the names that get listed off in it. Some of them are contemporary, some are otherwise, but here we go. Dear Sir, I have received your favor of the 17th and communicated it to Mr. Smith. I lately forwarded your letter from Dr. Priestley, endorsed quote unquote with a book. I struck those words through with my pen because no book had then come. It now received and shall be forwarded to Richmond by the first opportunity, but such opportunities are difficult to find. Gentlemen going in the stage, not liking to take charge of a packet, which is to be attended to every time the stage is changed. The best chance will be some captain of vessel, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so I'm not going to read all that. I have lately, by accident, got a sight of a single volume of the Abe Burrell's quote-unquote anti-social conspiracy, which gives me the first idea I have ever had of what is meant by the Illuminatism, okay, which is the Illuminati, against which Illuminate Morse, as he is now called, and his ecclesiastical and monarchical associates have been making such a hue and cry. So let me stop there for a second. What Jefferson's talking about is this Illuminati conspiracy going nuts in Europe that is trying to destroy, in fact, really a lot of it's in Adam Weishaupt's own words, trying to put an end to government, monarchies, I should say more particularly at least, monarchies and religions. Okay, so reading on, Burrell's own parts of the books are perfectly the ravings of a bedlamite, but he quotes largely from Weishaupt, whom he considers as a founder of what he calls the order. So he's talking about Adam Weishaupt there. Reading on. As you may not have had an opportunity of forming a judgment of this cry of mad dog, which has been raised against his doctrines, I will give you the idea I have formed from only an hour's reading of Burrell's quotations from him, which you may be sure are not the most favorable. Weishaupt seems to be an enthusiastic philanthropist. So let me stop there for a second again. Jefferson is speaking very kindly of Adam Weishaupt, the founder of the Illuminati. Again, that is historical fact. All right. Maybe someone else is involved or whatever, but certainly Weishaupt had his hand. Okay. And the Illuminati at the time was a thing, and it was causing quite a stir in Europe. All right. Now, we're not talking about, what did Katy Perry do on a music video this week or something like that as far as an Illuminati. We're talking about the actual historical Illuminati. Is it something that still exists today? Well, that's where conjecture comes in and speculation and conspiracy theories come in. Okay, at this time frame, right now we're in the, just about to go into the 19th century. Yes, it's a real thing. And Weishaupt is, a real person. But again, Jefferson is saying, look, this guy's an enthusiastic philanthropist. This guy's trying to help humanity. This guy's great. So reading on. He is among those, as you know, the excellent Price and Priestley also are, who believe in the indefinite perfectibility of man. He thinks he may in time be rendered so perfect that he will be able to govern himself in every circumstance so as to injure none, to do all the good he can, to leave government no occasion to exercise their powers over him, and of course to render political government useless. So let's stop there. This is where, understand, Jefferson is praising this guy. And as we read more in the letter, you're going to see Jefferson is like, I love what this guy has in mind. But what exactly did we just describe here that Adam Weishaupt was shooting for? Anarchism. He was saying, eventually, I'm going to make government useless. Now, this is a funny thing because, usually when you hear, especially in libertarian and even anarchist circles and some other areas, right? When you hear the word Illuminati, you instantly think evil. But here's a description from Thomas Jefferson about the guy that founded the damn thing, and his description is seemingly quite the opposite. I mean, for all intents and purposes, the Free State Project would be considered the Illuminati today. Based upon like this kind of description, and I'm not praising the Free State Project, I'm just saying that like an anarchist movement is effectively, equates to the Illuminati. Now, let's read on some more here. So this is Godwin's doctrine, and this is what Robinson, Burrell, and Morse had called a conspiracy against all government. Weishaupt believes that to promote this perfection of the human character was the object of Jesus Christ. That his intention was simply to reinstate natural religion, and by diffusing the light of his morality, to teach us to govern ourselves. His precepts are the love of God and love of our neighbor, in natural state of liberty and equality. He says no one ever laid a surer foundation for liberty than our Grand Master, Jesus of Nazareth. He believes the Freemasons were originally possessed of the true principles and objects of Christianity and have still preserved some of them by tradition, but much disfigured. So even Adam Weishaupt saying, well, the Freemasons have lost their way. And now, keep in mind that we have in this 2-year period of 1798 to 1800, you have Thomas Jefferson having, clearly having this meeting or correspondence of whatever kind with Adam Weishaupt. And suddenly he starts working on this new version of the Bible that is supposedly the pure product of Jesus of Nazareth. He's doing exactly what Adam Weishaupt was saying Jesus originally was putting out there. So one would argue that Jefferson was getting in on this conspiracy because he is delivering what Adam Weishaupt said Jesus was really trying to do, was trying to create this, this way of life where people govern themselves. There is no more government. They won't even have the opportunity to exact their powers upon anyone. And I think it's really interesting. This letter is so fascinating because I think it's really interesting that he says that Weishaupt, he's describing what Weishaupt described to him as far as what this non-government world would look like. He says that may in time be rendered so perfect that he will be able to govern himself in every circumstance so as to injure none. He's talking about, I'm not going to, I'm never going to hurt anybody anymore. I'm not going to hurt anybody. It's going to be over. Like this idea of using violence, done. Violence won't even be a part of the game. When this perfection of man, finally hits stride and becomes a kind of a part of life. Now, that's going to be important. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. But anyway, let's read on a little bit here. The means he possesses to effect this improvement, and of course, this is Jefferson talking about Adam Weishaupt, of human nature are quote, to enlighten men, to correct their morals, and inspire them with benevolence. Secure of our success, says he, we abstain from violent commotions, to have foreseen the happiness of posterity, and to have prepared it by irreproachable means suffices for our felicity. The tranquility of our consciences is not troubled by the reproach of aiming at the ruin or overthrow of states or thrones. End quote. So what Weishaupt here is really, or what Jefferson is directly quoting, supposedly Weishaupt, in saying is that, like, we're going to get to this point, this perfectibility of man, but we're going to get there without firing a shot. Okay, we're just going to, for lack of a better term, we're going to subvert culture. We're going to subvert everything to where monarchies and religions just go the way of the dodo automatically. They become anathema to the human mind, and it's all going to be done with absolute benevolence. The end, the ends are going to, the means will not conflict with, the ends. This is really something. So let me read, I'll read some more here. As Weishaupt lived under the tyranny of, this is Jefferson talking, as Weishaupt lived under the tyranny of a despot and priests, he knew that caution was necessary even in spreading information and the principles of pure morality. He proposed, therefore, to lead the Freemasons to adopt this object and to make the objects of their institution the diffusion of science and virtue. He proposed to initiate new members into his body by gradations proportioned to his fears of the thunderbolts of tyranny. This has given an air of mystery to his views, was the foundation of his banishment, the subversion of the Masonic order, and is the color for the ravings against him of Robinson, Birrell, and Morse, whose real fears are that the craft meaning Freemasonry, would be endangered by the spreading of information, reason, and natural morality among men. This subject being new to me, I have imagined that if it be so to you also, you may receive the same satisfaction in seeing which I have had in forming the analysis of it. And I believe you will think with me that if Weishaupt had written here, where no secrecy is necessary, in our endeavors to render men wise and virtuous, he would not have thought of any secret machinery for that purpose. As Godwin, if he had written in Germany, might probably also have thought secrecy and mysticism prudent. I will say nothing to you on the late Revolution of France, which is painfully interesting, he's saying that, now that's interesting there, because one could argue that, well, the French Revolution is like the fruition of this Illuminati goal of getting rid of religion in the state, blah, blah, blah. But he's calling it painfully interesting because Jefferson is recognizing that Jefferson himself and Weishaupt, both see that we're not going to get there through violence. It's not going to happen through revolution. Okay, getting to this, this era of science and virtue. So reading on a little more, perhaps when we know, they saw the French Revolution as being, an unfortunate thing. Reading on, perhaps when we know more of the circumstances which gave rise to it and the direction it will take, Bonaparte, its chief organ, may stand in a better light than at present. I am with great esteem, dear sir, your affectionate friend. So, that's one of the most fascinating letters in history that you could possibly ever read anywhere. And it's a lot of the bulk of the information in many ways, or it's a good chunk of information that people have about the character of Adam Weishaupt, it would seem. And, you're taking Jefferson's word on it, which for a lot of people, Jefferson's word's pretty good. He's certainly one of the most quoted people in history. Now, what I want to kind of break into, with this, I mean, this has got to, if you're a person that's like, oh, the evil Illuminati, blah, 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 the description of here's Jefferson admitting that what the Illuminati were doing / Freemasons, because they kind of became one group for a little while, at least under Weishaupt's tutelage. What you have here is a very benevolent group, not malevolent, right? As to where when you think Illuminati, you think bad, 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 evil, Satan, blah, blah, blah. That's not what's being described. What's being described here is a future where there is no more need for violence, and people are just living it up and they're doing as much good as they can. It's kind of beautiful what you're reading, especially for the time, and especially if you take into the context, the English being used here. It's really something. So now, the fascinating part in all of this is that, who are the characters perhaps that, and this is, I'm doing some very broad historical strokes. So a point, okay, I want to switch gears just a little bit because, so one could argue that Adam Weishaupt was a German philosopher. He had this idea of the perfectibility of man, that you could get to this point to where, man would, who was it that was it Thomas Paine that said this, that if men were angels, they wouldn't need a government. And if angels were meant something along those lines, but that, men weren't angels. But this is, Weishaupt's idea is that you could get to the point to where men were effectively, and men as in humanity, could be angels, and that they could get to that stage. Now, the fascinating thing is that, Weishaupt's not the only German philosopher that would end up coming up with this idea. In the 19th century, we would end up with, in my opinion, one of the greatest philosophers of all time, German or otherwise, that being Max Stirner. And his work would, of course, come many years later after Weishaupt was a thing and Jefferson was even alive. But his work would come out, of course, that being The Ego in Its Own, which I've talked about. I did a whole Patreon special, describing egoism and all that, or egoist anarchism, even though maybe Stirner wouldn't have even used the word anarchism. But regardless, there was obviously some very interesting things happening, some interesting conversations, maybe gatherings in Germany in the 19th century, describing a lot of different, there was, certainly wasn't all anarchism, but a lot of different, huge discourses going on. We even know, Max Stirner was hanging out with some pretty big names in his day. And, he'd keep telling them, oh yeah, I've got this, magnum opus that I'm working on or whatever, and eventually would come out. Of course, the book, The Ego in Its Own, would kind of be ignored. And honestly, I think in many ways still is, or if it's not ignored, it's certainly not read, cover to cover, which it really should be. But Stirner would come to an interesting conclusion, throughout, and it's one of his points, throughout The Ego in Its Own. Okay. And that is that there have been 3 stages to human evolution. Okay. And he's not talking about physical evolution. He's talking more of a mental evolution. There are 3 stages to human evolution. There was 3 epochs, I think is about maybe the term that he would use. There was the realism epoch. Then there was the spiritual epoch. And then there was the epoch to come. There was the time to come, which you would call the egoist, epoch. Okay. And that's what his writing was all about, trying to kind of bring into fruition. Now, the fascinating thing is that when you read about when you kind of discern what Max Stirner's egoist epoch is, it sounds damn familiar, other than this concept of natural religion, but that's a loaded term. Okay. But it sounds damn familiar to what Weishaupt and Jefferson are talking about, in the early parts of, or, the later part of the 18th century. So the realistic, so to break those down, the realistic or the realism epoch or the realist epoch is kind of, pretty much before ancient Greece. And it was a time where man completely relied upon materialism, like completely relied upon, just what was in front of him. Maybe man wasn't very inventive. He had to use the natural resources that are more available to him. There wasn't a lot going on upstairs, mentally. Okay. I'm not saying I agree with that 100%, but I get his point. Then he talks about the spiritual epoch, which was actually brought on by Christianity. Okay. Which is interesting because remember, Weishaupt and Jefferson are saying, yeah, there was this like original form of Christianity that actually brought man to this next level of evolution, right? Which is very similar to what Max Stirner would be talking about. Okay. To where you had this, not spiritual. I mean, yeah, it's spiritual, in a sense. But Stirner was saying, yeah, there's a spiritual epoch where what he meant by spiritual was that it was the mental epoch. It was when we weren't so concerned with the physical. It's where we started developing our brains. It's where we started to, imagine, and get inventive and creative and all this, like a lot of this, like really heavy, like inward looking aspects of humanity, came to fore. And there's various points where he talked with Greek philosophers where that seemed to, start becoming a thing. When you read The Ego in Its Own, you find out about this. Okay. And, these stages are, they're evolutionary stages. And eventually what you're supposed to end up with is the egoist epoch, okay, to where literally every individual is governing themselves, all the same things that Jefferson and Weishaupt are talking about, which I find to be, very fascinating. This is why I say I think if Jefferson was really buying into what Weishaupt was selling, Jefferson was slowly becoming an anarchist, or, and he became an anarchist, in the end, I think. I would argue Thomas Paine may have, gone down a similar road. And obviously there's probably a million letters we don't have now that I'm sure went into much greater depth with a lot of this stuff. And I mean, and it's fascinating. Like I like what Jefferson had to say. It's like, if only Adam Weishaupt were in America. This is kind of the reason I don't buy into the George Washington argument that Weishaupt was actually George Washington. Because Jefferson's saying, look, if Weishaupt was actually in America, he wouldn't have had to be secret about it. He could have been very open about it. And, and people might have said, okay, yeah, no, we like these merits. Let's start working towards this. It's also kind of the reason that I don't necessarily buy that there's still like an Illuminati or that the Freemasons actually have any kind of foothold or anything, because what we know of what the guy, that being Adam Weishaupt, originally wanted for all this, what this grand conspiracy was all supposed to be about, is not happening in this country, not in the United States, not by a fucking long shot, like, I mean, because, really they're describing anarchism, and getting rid of all social institutions, just like Max Stirner would talk about. Now I'm not saying Max Stirner was a part of the Illuminati. I don't think so, but it's fascinating that there must have been tracts and pamphlets and works going around in Germany in the 19th century that could help lead a person in these directions of saying, no, this is what we got to end up, becoming. I mean, maybe Max Stirner was influenced by the Illuminati. I don't know. I think Jefferson was certainly influenced by it, even though he didn't do a whole hell of a lot about it. Obviously, again, he still had slaves, and one could argue that Weishaupt's work, or, the works of the Bavarian Illuminati and all this, was one of the things that would put an end to slavery, because it was that cultural subversion that would help make it distasteful. In Europe, because like I've said many times, look, in Europe, you didn't need a civil war. Okay. It eventually, it became illegal on the books, but it became anathema culturally. Slavery became anathema culturally long before it ever, was put into law that, no, slavery isn't allowed anymore. So yeah, in sharing all this, like, I feel like that the idea, bolstering, when I said that when I went to Monticello, that some of my wilder historical theories were really kind of bolstered, this is much of what I meant. And that is that, yeah, we, some of the founding fathers, I think, were anarchists. I think they were trying to get to an anarchist society. That ended up not happening because of characters like George Washington and Hamilton, among a bunch of others that just really, kind of took over. And that, Jefferson was, because a lot of people get into this, was Jefferson actually a Freemason, blah, blah, blah. Well, maybe it looked like things were working outside of that there were groups. I mean, they weren't the only ones. It wasn't just like Jefferson and Weishaupt were talking about, secret groups and the benefits of that, and spreading like these kind of ideas and everything. I mean, obviously the Jefferson Bible didn't take off. Most people, like I said, when I went to Monticello, most people didn't even know what the fuck it was. Okay. So this idea that, Jesus of Nazareth was spreading morals that would bring the perfection of humanity, into existence. That didn't happen. Okay. That just fucking didn't happen, at all. That revolution really seemed to have failed. But again, they weren't the only ones. The other picture, like I said, that kind of stood on its own in the drawing room, where I said, and in fact, it was right next to, this is interesting. It was right next to the painting of John the Baptist, or John the Baptist's head, which is where I think that there's this tie-in to this idea that there has been this long work towards, perfecting humanity, okay, throughout history. I mean, literally long history is in thousands of years. There is the picture of Benjamin Franklin, okay, right next, just like cornered off from the head of John the Baptist. Now, when you read like the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, which I have, when you read that, there's an interesting point where Franklin talks about the Society of the Free and Easy. And he explicitly says it needs to be secret, but it will be this, I mean, he's saying this will be this group that will help spread, kind of this new morality, and this new way of thinking, and all of this, throughout the Americas. Now, the fascinating aspect like he's talking about the subversive force, much like Weishaupt is doing, and Jefferson was hoping wouldn't be necessary, but he understood why it would get wrapped up, as a secret kind of teaching or something. It's interesting that, the Society of the Free, or that this idea of the Society of Free and Easy, which again would be kind of like a Freemasonry sort of, he only talks about it for a couple paragraphs, but he puts it out, it's young men that they go out there and they start being nice and everything, or, whatever, they try to kind of change the culture, be the subversive force in culture. Again, not a malevolent group at all. But it's interesting that Benjamin Franklin, like Thomas Jefferson, seems to start thinking of a lot of these different ideas after visiting France. What the hell was going on in France? Besides the French Revolution, which, Jefferson speaks against. And to say nothing of Thomas Paine's time in France and all this. Just like there was really these evolutionary, I don't want to say revolutionary, because the French Revolution, not okay. There was this evolutionary, kind of ideas that were starting to crop up in the later parts of the 18th century and the 19th century. And there were groups that were at least tried to get formed that were, kind of working on this for a while. But yeah, it would seem that it never really took off, and it unfortunately never really happened, and does that mean that these ideas, that the concept of subverting culture is a failure? I don't think so, because it seems like some of Weishaupt's ideas actually delivered the goods in Europe proper. And, now atheism does seem to have, really, really kind of finally taken hold, which maybe is the first part of, how you get to an actual anarchist society is by first, we got to get rid of the religion. And then, then you can get people to, unfortunately what happens is a lot of people that become atheists, they just supplant God with the state, right? Or, they have the state become their religion. But you got to get rid of one of those, and then maybe you can get rid of, government in general. But I think that they were hitting on some amazing ideas, and maybe they were just way ahead of their time. I guess that's the bottom line I want to get to, is that there have been people that have recognized for a long time that humanity didn't just suddenly come up with this shit in the past, in the 20th century, that even a couple hundred years before, the groundwork was being laid, and the understanding of how to get to this world, was already being thought up, that you're going to do it through subversion, through cultural corruption, and I mean that in a good way. And you're going to, because corruption's a good thing. Well, all right. Cultural corruption's a good thing. Moral corruption's a good thing. But you're going to get there by, again, by not necessarily by secrecy, but just by, it's going to be done peacefully. And that these notions were known by people throughout history. And also, the other point I want to bring up with this too, is that it's amazing how much with Max Stirner, I want to reference this, okay, because I've noticed that egoist anarchism seems to be getting kind of popular, or at least a lot of people are reading The Ego and Its Own. I notice a lot of people, when they read that book, or they claim to read the book, they come away with it like, oh yeah, give me my AK-47, hand over the toothbrushes, blah, 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 and they're ready to all get violent, and they use it to make an excuse for all kinds of violence. Now, obviously they're not the only ones that have made this mistake. Arguably Mussolini, used the arguments of Max Stirner to explain why he could, run, go nuts with, with his soldiers and have a violent revolution of his own, in Italy. That's outrageous. That's a absolute misunderstanding of what Stirner had to say. He wasn't really pushing for violent means, and I think that when you put in light all of these characters of the time, of the 19th century, because Jefferson and Weishaupt were both present and active in the 19th century, and again, like the Jefferson Bible would finally be done in 1819. That when you put all these, characters together, you realize that they're all kind of talking about the same aims, same goals. And I think that the fact that what Weishaupt had to say and Jefferson were talking about is so similar to what Stirner was putting out there that I think it really helps kind of enlighten what Stirner was saying, in realizing that Stirner was also talking about, look, you're only going to get to the egoist epoch through benevolence, through peaceful means, maybe subversive, but very peaceful means. So yeah, bolstered a lot of ideas that I've held. Seeing Jefferson's home, I'm going to wrap this up. I've been going an hour and a half, and I don't know if everything I've said has been really made a whole ton of sense, but whatever, it's bonus shit. So, and it's new. Like some of the stuff I've never talked about with people, so it's kind of the first time. So I don't always have all my thoughts together for it. But what it really bolstered for me was that Jefferson, I think, was buying into this alternative history that, say, an Adam Weishaupt and that, like, the order of the Illuminati and maybe the Freemasons were kind of schlepping around, and that he was working towards similar aims, with some of his work, and unfortunately he never, like, maybe the reason that it failed is because Jefferson never really fully integrated it, because again, he kept slaves. And I don't think that it's, personally myself, to get to the egoist epoch, I don't think having slaves is okay. And maybe he realized that, maybe he was working towards it, in his writings. He definitely had some anti-slavery writings, no doubt about that. Like I said, I think, the Illuminati had, the real Illuminati of the 18th, 19th century, really had anti-slavery stances. So, some of that bore out, and I guess just some of it didn't, and it didn't in Monticello, unfortunately. But yeah, so I feel like some of my wilder theories are really kind of proven by being there, that Jefferson was in a lot of this game. And I've talked about this before. I think it's interesting. Like I said, Jefferson had sort of this holy trinity. Sir Francis Bacon, who I think is also instrumental in a lot of revolutionary or evolutionary movements of Europe of his day. Like when you read the book, The New Atlantis, of this is how you can actually organize society. This is what a utopia can look like. Then you have Isaac Newton, who certainly had some pretty wild notions himself, the Emerald Tablet and some interesting interpretations of the Book of Daniel, the Bible in general, right? And of science, that science could explain the world and was legitimate and everything. And then you have John Locke, who was so big on, the main thing that everybody takes, of course, is from John Locke's second treatise of government, which is life, liberty, and property. But again, it's fascinating that Jefferson changes that to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He does not include property as part of, what makes the really beneficial, or what makes for the great human condition. And I find that fascinating too. And again, that goes back to Stirner, where Stirner made it very clear. He said, I have no hard dogma on property. He said, because property can become as tyrannical as any government or religion. Not saying that he didn't believe in property. And then there becomes a problem with terms, right? Because, Stirner would talk about ownness. That's not self-ownership. It's actually kind of a separate term. There's some ideas that I think we need to be looking back at, that were getting explored, and some connections perhaps that need to be put together, like Jefferson, Weishaupt, Stirner. I'm not saying Jefferson was a good guy, making that very, very clear. I do think Weishaupt might have been trying to be a good guy. And Stirner, his story his life story is as boring as, any could be. His work was just so, his book, The Ego in Its Own, was just this seminal thing, fortunately. But anyway, I think there's some connections to be made there. I think there's some, I think my trip to Monticello, seeing a lot of this stuff, really bolstered my outlook on Jefferson as not being a good guy, but that also he was buying into some very, very interesting alternative versions of history. And I didn't even get to, I said he was really big on measurements. He was trying to come up with an entirely new measurement system, like metric or imperial, but an entirely new one. That one could argue was based on a very old system of measurement called the megalithic yard. That's getting into some conspiracy theory. But anyway, he had some wild notions. And yeah, some of those, unfortunately, I didn't get to see at Monticello. But, you know, some of them I really think I did. Especially, I thought the paintings were very interesting, you know, among other things. So, whoo, okay. There you have it. That is it. We're an hour and 40 in. That is my Monticello special. It was enjoyable. Going there. I mean, it was sad at the same time, you know, seeing, you know, what slavery really looked like. And that's just so pathetic. And you know what, just real quick, I just want to say this. When you consider the life of John Hemmings, one of his slaves, like John Hemmings just shows, like, you know, this argument that somehow black people are inferior. Are you fucking kidding me? Monticello wouldn't exist if it wasn't for John Hemmings' brain, let alone his skill, you know, with his hands. I mean, just fucking remarkable. Like even like the carriages that they had shown off, you know, John Hemmings like streamlined those. Like this guy was sort of the, I don't know, not the Henry Ford, because he was only big for factories, not for car design. But, you know, this guy was the car designer of his day. I mean, he was making Porsches. This slave was effectively designing his own Porsches, you know, of their time. I use Porsche as, you know, as an analogy, as a metaphor for what he was designing with the, you know, these various carriages that were, because Thomas Jefferson liked to drive fast, you know, with horse and carriage, of course, but he liked to drive really fucking fast. And so, you know, John Hemmings, his slave, had to design, again, there's plenty of things that Jefferson designed, but there's also clearly, evidently, you know, things that John Hemmings designed as well, that were fucking brilliant. So it just tosses all that shit, you know, right out the door. You know, the idea that somehow, you know, black people are dumber or something like, I mean, that's so stupid. Race really is a social construct. Anyway, all right, that's enough. It was a fascinating visit. There's probably a million other things I could say about it, but I wanted to get into that little bit of history, I think Jefferson was working with some very secretive orders of history that really existed at that time. Do they still exist now? Again, that's where the debate comes in, but I'll leave that one to you. Woo! I have a Q&A coming out tomorrow, and of course, all new Sovereign Tech coming out this week. I'll see you. Oh man, I can't wait to go see Alien Company 2. Woo! I'll see you on the other side.
You just experienced Sovereign Tech. Go to sovereigntech.com, that's SOVRYN tech.com, and connect with us there. Find links from today's show and catch our podcast feed. Sovereign Tech is copy heart. Copying art is an act of love, and love is not subject to law. So please share the show however you like. Welcome to the evolution.